Good morning, fellow pilgrims. Today we are for Exodus 23. Today's comments are separated actually into three parts, talking about justice, a subject which will please anyone on earth who has been oppressed, justice for all. And then we're going to talk about the Sabbath laws. We'll talk about the three annual festivals and God's angel to prepare. Who is that angel? Oh, those comments, our comments today is going to be based on those three main issues. Justice for all, laws of justice and mercy. Evaluate your actions by God's standards in Exodus 23, 1 through 9. 1, you shall not circulate a false report. A false report. This is an expansion of the 9th commandment, which forbids calumny, false and defamatory statements, and slander. The last half of the verse prohibits joining with others in spreading this mischief. No word, church. When I went through this, I felt sad because we are in the mud. In our churches, a lot of circulation of false reports. We're not perfect, but we need to go beyond this. We need to overcome all this. You shall not circulate a false report. Exodus 23, verses 1 and 7. Though the word witness implies that the law is concerned primarily with conduct in court, it is not confined to that. We shall see that very soon. 2, we shall not follow a crowd to do evil. Some of us follow bad people to do evil in the church, not follow a multitude. Omitting the word do in this first clause, which is not in the original Hebrew. This prohibition covers not only evil in deed, but also in word and thought. Remembering the words of Jesus, we are not to take the manner of life of the many as our example. One of the chief dangers facing professed Christians is that of pliant willingness, easily bent to follow the crowd, to do evil, notwithstanding the scriptural admonition against such a tendency. I was shocked to find out what God said we should not do. It's a lot there. Number 3, you shall not show partiality to a poor man. No, don't show partiality to neither rich or poor. God is just. Showing partiality to the poor is unjust. Showing partiality to the rich is not good. To lean either way will be a perversion of justice. Justice is supposed to be blind, isn't it so? But today, our justice have 3 eyes opened. Number 4, you shall not have enemies. I don't like this man. I don't like this woman. You are not to like people. Love them. We like people who do the things we want to do. God says it's okay, but you have to love them. This refers to a private enemy, not to a public one, as in Deuteronomy 23. It anticipates the true state of Christianity as laid down by Christ in his rebuke of the rabbinical distortions of the Mosaic law. Don't have enemies. The overburdened ass of an enemy must not be left without offering help to help the enemy get the animal back on his feet so it may continue on its way. This joint merciful participation will bring the 2 men into friendly contact and thus invite a possible reconciliation. So certainly God is not happy with misunderstandings in the church. 5, you shall not take a bribe. Take no gift. The acceptance of a bribe from one of the parties in a suit and the shaping of justice accordingly has ever been one of the most common and reprehensible sins of judges in the East and in the world today. Bribery defeats the whole purpose for which the administration of justice exists, for its weight. In this case of justice, tips them the wrong way. For this reason, it has generally carried the death penalty. While the Mosaic Code fixes no penalty for this evil, Josephus, the great writer, historian, affirms that the Jews put the offender to death. Nevertheless, whatever the penalty was, it must have been ignored. Number 6, you shall not forget where you came from. Where did they come from? They came from Egypt, where they were oppressed. All of us have come from families somewhere where one is oppressed or we are oppressed. It says, don't forget where you come from. You come from a country where people are oppressed. You come from family people are oppressed. Don't perpetuate it. Don't oppress a stranger. This repeats the injunction of chapter 22, 21, and probably applies to cause of justice. The word heart denotes the mind, the feelings. In other words, sympathy should be extended to the stranger. You shall not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. The law of God gave the poor a right to a certain portion of the produce of the soil. When hungry, a man was at liberty to go to his neighbor's field or orchard or vineyard and eat of the grain or fruit to satisfy his hunger. Don't carry a bag there. Just eat to your satisfaction and leave. It was in accordance with this permission that the disciples of Jesus plucked and ate of the standing grain as they passed through a field upon Sabbath day. And no matter how Jesus was righteous, the Pharisees were there to criticize him. Sometimes, no matter how good you are in your church, there are people who don't just like you. No matter what you do, you cannot satisfy them. They are not positive, they are not contributing, just criticizing. They remain there in the church. They are there in the church board. They are there in high places. Let's talk about Sabbath laws. Sabbath rest is about relationship. The 7th year, though other nations had their days of rest at regular or irregular intervals, entire years of rest were observed by the Israelites. This may have exposed them to the rebuke of idleness by other nations. Since agriculture was primitive, crop rotation unknown, and artificial fertilizers were not used, it is possible that no financial loss resulted from the program. However, the desire for gain made the enforcement of the provision difficult. The 70 years captivity was intended to make up for the failure to observe the sabbatical years. 7th year, don't plant anything there, eat of what comes out of there so that the land can rest. The primary purpose of this law, as yesterday, was to provide for the poor what the land produces of itself without cultivation belonged to all as a common possession, even to the beasts of the field. It was no doubt intended also that the sabbatical year should be one of increased religious observance, in which the solemn reading of the law at the Feast of Tabernacles in the year of release played a part. This sabbatical year must have been a solemn season, one of which led to self-examination, the formation of holy habits, and brought spiritual uplift to the people. Since grain, wine, and oil were the important products of Palestine, it is apparent that the whole land was to rest, but they did not obey. And this Hebrew said this: if we do not allow for a rhythm of rest in our overly busy lives, illness becomes our Sabbath. Our pneumonia, our cancer, our heart attack, our accidents create Sabbath for us. God forbid. The law in the New Testament, foundational laws are always applicable. God is able to set the boundaries of his law. For example, Jesus called himself the Lord of the Sabbath. The underlying principles of the case laws are always applicable. They merely illustrate the foundational laws. The ceremonial laws find their fulfillment in Jesus Christ, Romans 10:4. The 3 harvests. We have the Passover, the Pentecost, and the Feast of Trumpets. The Passover was also called the unleavened bread. Leaven was a symbol of sin and error, that is yeast. Unleavened bread was a representative of the freedom from sin of him who is the bread of life. This feast, the Feast of Passover, was a type of the deliverance of sinners from sin through the death of Christ. When the Savior offered himself at Calvary, the significance of the Passover ceased, for it looked forward to him. The ordinance of the Lord's Supper was instituted as a memorial of the same event. So actually, the Passover commemorated the first coming of Christ. The Pentecost, which was done in summer, the 50th day was called the Feast of the Weeks because 7 full weeks separated it from the Passover. This feast was celebrated late in our month of May or early in June, the time of the spring harvest. All these feasts were celebrated at the end of harvest time of each period. Jewish tradition connected the feast with the giving of the law, which occurred about 50 days after the departure from Egypt. For the Christians of apostolic times, it commemorated also the giving of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, when the infant church gathered in the first fruits of the gospel. The Feast of the Trumpets, the 8-day festival, commenced late in October and early November. The olives had been harvested and the vintage completed. The Holy Convocation marks its opening and close. The Feast of Tabernacles were not only pointed back to the wilderness sojourn, but like the Feast of Harvest, it anticipated the ingathering of the harvest of the earth. That is talking about Christ's second coming. You see, God is so wise. In his infinite wisdom, the heathens had their feasts during harvests. So God had this feast for them, so they don't have to even go to the hidden feasts. The feasts were timed for the end of each harvest. The angel and the promises. See, I'm sending an angel before you to protect you on your journey and lead you safely to the place I have prepared for you. In these close verses of the book of the covenant, we find the promises God will fulfill should the people observe his requirements. God ever encourages us with the recompense of the reward. These promises were conditional, for God can bless his people only if they obey him. The angel refers to the messenger of the covenant, that is to Christ. The word angel means messenger and is translated as often as one way as the other. Christ was ever the messenger of God to Israel, and as such conveyed to them a knowledge of the character, will, and mercy of God. Some of us feel offended that Christ is called an angel. Well, angel means messenger. First of all, before Christ died, he said, now you are no more my servants, you are my brothers. You see, Christ is all in all to us. He's our brother, he's our elder, he's our angel, he's our everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. He is the wonderful counselor. He's the everlasting Father. In the way, the angel will guide you in the way, not only to guide them geographically, but spiritually as well in the paths of righteousness. He will not pardon. Aha. Suppose say this angel will not pardon. No, this does not mean that God will not actually pardon, for God's love ensures that he will, but it does express with typical Eastern emphasis the sovereign justice and holiness of God. My name is in him. Here the first person of the Godhead, the Father, speaks of the second person of the Godhead, his Son. This statement implies that the angel bearing God's name is co-equal with God himself, not bow down. So remember that the idolatrous worship of these hidden peoples was licentious and debasing in the extreme. The ceremonies of some hidden deities were defiled by human sacrifices and polluted by prostitution. The iniquity of these nations was now full. It is not to be wondered at that they were due to feel the full measure of divine wrath. God intended that he would take sickness away from us. He doesn't want us to be sick. So if God is so good, why is there sickness? It is not his fault. It is our fault. It's the result of sin. Healthful living in itself goes far to protect one from sickness of mind and soul, as well as of body. Conversely, godliness promotes physical well-being. There shall be nothing cast. Don't make images. This could be the result of a special interposition of divine favor and providential care, as well as of faithful living. Not only would there be no premature births, delivering before the time, but as the last clause implies, premature death will also be unknown. That was God's plan for us. God said he will not drive them out fast, these people. He said little by little, while men are impatient, God is long-suffering and wonderfully forbearing. The Canaanite nations will not be driven out all at once, lest the land should become desolate, there not being enough people to care for. The beasts of the field should multiply and so become a danger. In another reason why the nations were not driven out immediately was that God desired to prove Israel to see whether they will obey him. So that was what God intended us to have. And it's my prayer that as we remain loyal to God, God will fulfill his plans in our lives. You can imagine that we are talking about justice for all, yes? That's God's desire. 2, we are talking about the laws of the Sabbath. There are blessings there. The annual feasts were designed for us to appreciate who God is and have a feast and be happy. God wants us to be happy in our churches. He said we should not bow down before the gods because he intends to bless. He warned us, don't go there. So that's a summary of what we have today. Food for thought number 1. God graciously provided the Israelites with laws and provisions for sin that will allow them to live as his chosen people. The whole covenant was God's way of ensuring that he could have fellowship with them and live among them. Take, for example, Exodus 23, verse 2. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. This is the perfect verse to argue against the excuse everybody is doing it. So what if everybody is doing it? Everybody is doing something, doesn't make it right. There are many times when entire societies are all doing it wrong. So when we go through the gamut of those 6 laws, we shall not circulate a false report, we shall not follow a crowd to do evil, we shall not show partiality, we shall not have enemies, we shall not take a bribe, we shall not forget where you come from. Is God speaking to us today? Food for thought number 2. The people, the Israelites, were surrounded by fierce warlike tribes that were eager to seize upon their lands. Yet 3 times every year, all the able-bodied men and all the people who could make the journey to the center place were directed to leave their homes and repair to the place of assembly near the center of the land. What was to hinder their enemies from sweeping down upon these unprotected households? To lay them waste with fire and sword? What was to prevent an invasion of the land that would bring Israel into captivity to some foreign foe? God had promised to be the protector of his people. And that same God will protect you and me today. The angel of Jehovah encamps around about them that fear him and delivers them. While the Israelites went up to worship, divine power will place a restraint upon their enemies. God's promise was, I will cast out the nations before thee and enlarge their borders. Neither shall any man desire thy land when thou shalt go up to appear before the Lord thy God thrice in the year. If God can do that, this idea of answering a phone call where you are in the church is an abomination. What if somebody called me? If they will call, let God take care of that. In my own personal experience, I've had audience with 2 presidents in my country. I've had audience with governors. Your phones are laid at way back in the reception. You will not be allowed to go with your phone in the presence of the head of state or the governor. God will take care of that. So God will protect us. So don't worry. God is never blind to your tears, never deaf to your prayers, and never silent to your pain. He sees, he hears, and he will deliver. So today's promise is, I will be an enemy to your enemies, and I will oppose those who oppose you. That's Exodus 33:22. Let's go for the last food for thought now. Pray for transformation of our hearts. Look at what Exodus 23:32 says. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. No covenant. The book of the covenant closes as it begins with a solemn charge against idolatry. The subsequent history of Israel shows how needful this repeated warning was and how necessary God's deep concern for them to avoid this error. Tragically, the warning was of no avail. Is that of no avail to us today too? Solomon went on to make peace with surrounding nations. With what result? Today, we need a transformation of our hearts. God should give us hearts of flesh, hearts of compassion. We are too much into fighting ourselves that we are not listening at all. Let God give us new hearts and write his laws in our hearts. And this church of God will change. A heart that is in tune with Christ will change. God bless you.